Welcome back to part 2 of our episode with Nancy Pearcey. As we have had a great conversation with her so far, we're going to continue the conversation as we dig deeper into this really, really important topic of sexuality. So Nancy, we're grateful that you've stuck with us. Came across an article, I shared this with you earlier, just a very short article from August 2nd from Entertainment Weekly. Demi Lovato, someone that certainly my teenage girls know who, they grew up watching her, and she's been very outspoken about her fluidity sexually. And she says here in this article, so for me, I'm such a fluid person. I felt especially last year that my energy was balanced, my masculine and feminine energy, so that when I was faced with the choice of walking into a bathroom and it said women and men, I didn't notice how often she says feel. I didn't feel like there was a bathroom for me because I didn't feel necessarily like a woman, nor did I necessarily feel like a man. I just felt like a human. That's why I'm now going with they, them. So the article was all about how she's moved from pronouns, from she, her to they, them. Here's the point I'm making. The feeling part of it all is such an emphasis, and that's the point that you're making is, and it occurs to me, if we went through all of life only based on feeling, what a wreck all of life would be. You're right. I mean, our feelings are all over the map. How can we trust them? How can we know that they can be trusted? And what breaks my heart and what you've seen in your years of studying and counseling and teaching and all your research is that you see people feel like I want to transition, and they do, and then get down that road and then feel, oh wait, what have I done? I don't want, and then so maybe talk just briefly about that. So what are some of the stories that you have personally, people, not just stories, people you've encountered with their stories of where their feelings have led them?
Yeah, it is something that I find I have to actually help people to see that their feelings change. Right. Feelings can change, and they often do. And so it just makes sense to treat your body as a reliable marker of your sex and gender. It's just rational. It just makes sense. But your second question about people who detransition.
Sure.
There's a growing community of detransitioners, and that's people who transition to the opposite sex and then, like you said, uh-oh, I think I just made a terrible mistake.
Right, yeah.
And one of my favorite stories is a young woman who transitioned to she was a girl who transitioned to boy at age 11. She lived as a trans boy for 3 years, and then at age 14 reclaimed her identity as a girl. And in an interview, she said, "The turning point came," and again, the direct quote, "The turning point came when I realized it's not conversion therapy to learn to love your body." And this would have been a great quote in a book called Love Thy Body. Unfortunately, it came out after my book was already published.
You just have to make it in the second edition.
Yeah, there you go. But it was on a very secular, liberal website. So, this is not from a Christian perspective at all. And she was saying, having been there, having detransitioned, she recognized that the key point was your view of the body.
Wow.
The goal was to love your body. And there's another, and you find this if you read the detransitioners. There was another young woman who had a blog. She'd transitioned at age 14, lived as a trans boy until age 19. And she said, when she transitioned, she was celebrated. She was supported. All her friends said, "Oh, wonderful!" And she, as she put it, all my friends on Tumblr were ecstatic. She said, "The boy me." That's how she put it. The boy me got a lot more affirmation than the girl me ever had. Right. So, which is, by the way, what teenager can resist that?
Sure.
You can
kind of, that's a big part of it.
You can see why that's appealing to a lot of young people. But then when she detransitioned, she said she lost all her friends. They all attacked her, they mocked her, they ridiculed, they were vicious. And so in this interview, she was asked, well, what would you say then to a young girl who's experiencing gender dysphoria? And she said almost the same words. She said, if I could convince just one young woman to love her body, then all the hostility I've experienced would be worth it. And I thought, this is so interesting. And you'll see this on secular websites now, by the way. Even secular people are starting to say that transgenderism represents body hatred. That's a term you see now. They'll say transgender ideology is body hatred. And I thought, wow, they're really recognizing that it's. This is where I would go beyond where Trevor Wax went, because that's true. It's your view of the self that's at issue, but it's actually your view of the body.
That's right.
That is. I think more
that's
foundational.
What's at stake. Right.
I think
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah. Quick pivot here, and then come back to this final question about how can we love and be compassionate while also not compromising truth. But one more little bit of a rabbit trail, but worth discussing. Many will come to you or even to me and say, what about those who are intersex? Talk about that. And maybe explain what it is first.
Yeah,
and then,
right.
Yeah, and then talk about that.
It is the question I get a lot because a lot of people think intersex is trans, and intersex is not the same thing as transgender. Transgender people have completely normal physical anatomy, right? Their genes, their gonads, their gender, their genitals all line up. So it's not a physical condition, it's a psychological condition where they feel, like you were saying earlier, they feel,
right.
Like maybe they are incongruent with their sexual identity.
Right.
Whereas intersex people actually do have a physical condition. It is a physical condition where due to malfunction in their chromosomes and their hormones, their anatomy isn't quite normal. It's atypical, it's ambiguous, and often they're infertile. In other words, they don't have normal sexual function.
Right.
And they have been used. The reason that people are confused about it is that they have been used. Intersex people have been used rhetorically to try to undermine, to deconstruct the male-female binary. So liberal people will say, the New York Times had an article not too long ago by a woman who was arguing that because of intersex, there is really no male and female. It's just a big spectrum. But what she didn't tell you is that less than 1% of people are actually intersex.
Yeah.
Numerically speaking, it can't be a spectrum,
right?
Because there's too few of them.
Right.
And then secondly, of course, there's only two gametes, the sperm and egg. There's not a spectrum in between. So if you talk to intersex people, they have a website, Intersex Association of America or something like that. Yeah. And they'll say, we're not claiming to be a third sex. We're not claiming to be a spectrum. We are perfectly happy trying to identify as either male or female. The vast majority of intersex people.
And we don't appreciate being used to make a statement for transgenderism, right? Yeah.
In fact, when I was writing Love Thy Body, I was contacted by an intersex woman. And I don't know how she heard that I was writing this book, but I was very glad to have a real live intersex woman to talk to. And she was one of the very few where her anatomy was ambiguous enough that they weren't quite sure if she was a boy or a girl. And so they raised her as a boy. And it wasn't until she was a young adult that she had a chromosome analysis done and found out that she was actually intersex. And she'd always felt more like a girl. She was very small and delicate. At any rate, so she then resolved the ambiguity in terms of female, and had hormones and surgery and so on. But at any rate, her point was, in contacting me, she used exactly the language you just said. We don't want to be a political football. We intersex people, we don't like being a political a pawn. Actually, here's how she put it. It hurts to be used as a pawn in someone else's game. Is how she put it.
Yeah.
And that is how they're being used today by a lot of secular people who want to say, there's not just a male-female binary. So
Sure.
they're using intersex people as a political football. And by the way, Christians need to read up on this a little bit too, because Christian churches don't always know what intersex means.
Mm-hmm.
And this young woman, her name's Leanne Simon, if you ever want to look her up. She's quite open about her intersex status. She has a website. But she was kicked out of some Christian churches because they thought she was trans. They thought, okay, you're lying about your sex. No, I'm intersex. Let me explain what that means. So it is important, I think, for Christians to educate themselves on what intersex means. It's just it's a physical and difference. How
Sure.
we don't talk about physical when people have physical problems. We just talk about in terms of differences. It's just a physical difference, like any other. Someone's born with a weak heart, or somebody's born with, poor eyesight, or somebody. We're all born with some sort of deformities or,
Sure.
lack of ability. And as Christian churches, we need to welcome and nurture people who have physical abnormalities of any kind.
Yeah.
So it is important for Christians to be well educated.
Absolutely. And I kind of, another question is occurring to me before we get to the last one that I want to finish on. Another related, I won't even call it a rabbit trail because it's certainly very important and poignant. Let's talk a little bit longer here and talk about gender dysphoria. And with it, what can we understand on that front? You're talking about be educated, read a little bit more, understand it. One of the things you shared with us this morning that I found really fascinating is that in my reading, I certainly learned a lot about the reality of gender dysphoria. It is real. It is a real issue that some face, and it's a real battle that people. It's more than just feelings, right? And in the sense of it can be onset very early in life. In fact, you shared, and correct me if I'm wrong, that true gender dysphoria typically happens at a very young age. You're not experiencing it for the first time. Almost certainly, almost always, you're not experiencing it for the first time as a teenager. Correct? Am I right in saying that?
Yeah. Well, these days they basically say now there's two forms of gender dysphoria.
Right.
That's how they sort of accommodate the fact that we have something new today. Traditionally, historically, gender dysphoria is something that shows up at a very young age. That's true. And in Love Thy Body, I do tell the story of a young boy who very clearly had gender dysphoria before he was even walking. He was gentle and sweet and sensitive and compliant and all the things we associate with girls. And, people would meet him and say, this is just not a boy, And we could talk about his story more, but just to get the big picture, these days, however, the vast majority of cases of gender dysphoria are showing up for the first time in adolescence or teen years.
Right.
And actually, researchers had to come up with a new name for it because it just was not the way gender dysphoria usually works. And so they call it rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Yeah. ROGD.
Yeah,
Yep.
there you go.
Yep.
And so it is very different. And so we can't really put the two together. The gender dysphoria starts at a very young age. So in my book, I call him Brandon, which is not his real name, but he, like I said, he had gender before he was even walking. It was very evident. And when he went to preschool, when his mother picked him up every day, he's playing with the little girls, not the little boys. By elementary school, he was already coming to his parents weeping and saying, I don't fit in anywhere. Here's how he put it. I think the way girls do. I'm interested in the things girls are. God should have made me a girl. And this is a very painful condition, like you were mentioning. It was a long, difficult battle. By teenage years, he was looking up sex reassignment surgery. And you ask, well, what did his parents do then? Well, first of all, they made sure that they knew he they loved him just the way he was. They didn't try to change him. I had a friend in seminary who was a former homosexual who said when he was young, he was interested in art and music, and his dad was baffled and kept trying to toughen him up by pushing him into more traditional things like sports. And Brandon's parents did not do that. They said it is perfectly okay to be a sweet, sensitive, gentle, emotional boy.
Mm-hmm.
It does not mean you're really a girl.
That's so important.
Yeah. And, they took him to the Myers-Briggs test and showed him you can be at either end of the spectrum. The very sensitive, relational type. You can be a boy or a girl. Or you can be the sort of rational, take charge, strong type, and you can be a boy or a girl. It's okay for girls to be non-gender conforming too.
Yeah.
In fact, their favorite line was his parents' favorite line was, "It's not you that's wrong; it's the stereotypes that are wrong."
Interesting.
And but I have to tell you, true gender dysphoria is very intractable. It really was until early 20s before he finally fully reconciled himself to the fact that he's a boy. And here's how he put it. I talked to him when he was, I think, about 21, and he said to me, "I finally realized that surgery would not give me what I want. It would not make me a girl," which is true.
Right.
It could change some external features, but it does not make you a girl. And that's when he sort of gave up on the idea of transitioning. But, when you ask, so what do we do when these kids show up in our family or our church or our school?
Yep.
I do think one of the first step is to make sure that we know we love them just the way they are and that we're not asking them to be different. Brandon tells me, by the way, he tells me that the worst places for stereotypes are Christian groups.
Yeah.
In a sense, Christians have leaned so far against the notion that gender is just a social construct and so on, that they almost overemphasize, you need to be a real boy, you need to do this and that, or you need, if you talk to my female students, because I teach at a Christian university, and I get a lot of stories from my female students about the pressure to fit into gender stereotypes. And so I do think that we talked about it earlier, but one of the things that Christian groups should make a point of is standing against the stereotypes. A lot of kids are being pushed into transitioning because they don't fit the stereotypes.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think about, and I've mentioned this in some conversations, is one of the ways I've watched the culture shift in general, and the Christian culture, I think, is done damage there for sure in terms of how we've tried to press into certain stereotypes. But I think about growing up. I grew up in the 80s. Born in 1979. I'm a kid of the 80s, and back then and into the 90s, totally normal to see a lot of tomboy girls. And I don't, of course, I was a kid at the time, but I don't think there was pressure on them back then to say, well, you're a tomboy, go ahead and take it all the way and be a boy, But that does seem to be at play now, right? Of just, hey, you've got a lot of these qualities that seem to be not feminine in nature, and so the pressure becomes take it all the way, right? Is that accurate to say that?
Oh, very much so. And if you talk to parents, you'll sometimes hear a lot of stories about the pressure their kids are under. And it used to be from the internet. Now it's from school. Now I hear more and more stories about kids who get the idea that they might be transgender from school. And you're right. Or you talk to older the parents, and the parents will say, "I was a tomboy.
Yeah.
I didn't like girly things.
Yeah.
I'm sure glad I lived, 2 decades ago."
Yeah.
Because if I were a kid today, I would be under tremendous pressure to transition. I do hear that a lot from women because, like you said, it was more common for girls to be tomboys, and that was totally acceptable. Yeah. But I wanted to add one more thing before we leave rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Sure.
And that is the first study ever done of these girls, because it is mostly girls, the numbers are much higher for girls than for boys now, which, by the way, is also non-traditional. Back when it was called transsexualism, it was almost purely a male thing.
Interesting.
And now it's almost purely a female thing, which is another reason people are like, well, what's going on? Something is happening here. This is not just genetic. It can't be just genetic. Genetic things don't change this quickly. But anyway, there was a study done by a professor at Brown University. Her name is Lisa Littman, Littman, and it was the first study done of rapid onset gender dysphoria. And what she found out was 63% of the girls in her study who'd come out as rapid onset gender dysphoria had been previously diagnosed with some sort of personality or emotional issue. And I emphasize diagnosed because a lot of teenagers have some anxiety or depression.
Sure.
Anyway, but these were kids were severe enough that they'd been taken to a counselor and received a diagnosis. And by the way, they were diagnosed before the onset of their gender dysphoria.
Right.
So, and what I mean by diagnosed, I'm OCD, manic depressive, of course, anxiety and depression, bipolar, and autism, self-harm. These were some of the things they'd been diagnosed with. And where that helps us is when these girls show up in our own families or schools or churches, we need to realize they are very fragile.
Yes.
Kids.
Yes.
They need us to handle them very gently.
And because of that fragile nature of their psyche and whatnot, they're believing the lie that, well, what will give me the stability that I'm wanting is if I transition. That'll get me what I'm ultimately longing for. And it's interesting. I quoted Littman, same study, in my sermon on Sunday. And the part that I quoted was where she said, in her research, 87% of these young girls, she was highlighting how a lot of it is social pressure from peers, right? And 87% of those girls who had become transgender, had been in social groups where one of their friends had transitioned, had been as a part of online groups and kind of niche websites where it was being talked about and pushed very heavily. And so it was, her point was simply, this was a very unacceptable result of a research from the culture's worldview, because the culture wants you to believe, the secular culture wants you to believe that this is totally coming from within. This is an intrinsic issue. And the research actually showed the opposite, that it's extrinsic in terms of how often, what's the catalyst behind the transition?
The term is social contagion. It's like when there's one kid commits suicide and there's a bunch of copycat suicides. Because I didn't know what social contagion meant, but that's what it means.
Sure.
So there's a lot of social contagion happening, and the Lisa Littman study, she found the vast majority, the whole friend groups were coming out at the same time as transgender. It's like, oh yeah, right. The whole friend group is finding their true, authentic self all at the same time.
Right.
That alone is enough to make it somewhat suspect. It's true natural change doesn't happen with your whole friend group at the same time. So I thought that was an interesting part of her research too. And by the way, you are right. Her findings were not welcome in secular academia. She was viciously attacked. They tried to get the journal that had published it. They tried to get them to retract it. Yeah. And they retracted it temporarily to say, okay, we'll reanalyze, we'll take a look at it. And then they had to republish it because, it was
accurate.
It was accurate.
Yeah. Well, let's end with as a pastor, I always come back to, the longing of the heart. What is it that I have 3 teenagers in my home right now. One 10-year-old, soon to be teenager. Because she's the youngest, she's 10 going on 15. But it's near and dear to my heart in terms of what our teenagers are facing today. And what is it that ultimately, what's the longing of the heart that's at play here? And how can we love this generation well and genuinely have compassion on them without affirming, right? And so the secular worldview would say, right now, what's being emphasized is, if you love me, you will affirm me. Those are equal in the eyes of the secular worldview. Whereas the biblical worldview says, well, love doesn't always equal affirmation. Love actually points us in a direction that's going to give us a greater experience of what is true love, which is often God shaping us. Well, what it always is biblically is God shaping us more and more into his image and us experiencing the love that we were created for that can only be found in him. And, but I'd love thoughts from you of just in your own experience. How do you show compassion and love to people who are really struggling with this, without affirming them, right? In the sense of, hey, I'm great with what the decisions that you're making, but I love you,
I would like to help them redefine what we mean by affirm, because the Christian ethic does affirm the value and dignity of their body,
Amen.
Of their biological sex. My book, Love Thy Body, it's not just moral arguments, it's full of stories, lots of anecdotes. Mm-hmm. And let me just give you two from homosexuality, the chapter on homosexuality. So the first one was a young woman who lived as a lesbian for many years, and today is married and has 2 kids. And she said, and here's her quote. I love her quote. She said, "I came to trust that God had made me female for a reason. And I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design."
Yep.
And that, we almost have to memorize some of these phrases to get ourselves used to using them. Honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. If we can, that's affirming in the sense of it's affirming their true worth and dignity. And the second example, again, is a young man who grew up homosexual, as he put it, exclusively attracted to other men. And what's interesting about his story is he grew up in a quote, gay-affirming family and attended a gay-affirming church. So he didn't think there was anything wrong with homosexuality as a Christian. And you say, well, then why did he change? By the way, he did change. Today he's married and has 3 kids. And by the way, he's also a Christian ethics professor in London. But he says, what changed me was not shame or guilt.
Yeah.
What changed me was reading about the body. He was my first example, by the way, that I found that affirmed my thesis of my book, which is, the answer to things like homosexuality is love your body. Because his story was, how did I change? I came to affirm my body. I said, I wasn't trying to change my feelings, because that rarely works. But I came to accept what I already had, which was a male body, as a good gift from God. That's a direct quote. And then eventually my feelings started to follow suit. So again, his point was, he wasn't acting out of shame or guilt or self-loathing. Homosexual activists will say if you change, it means you're acting out of self-loathing. He said, no, I came to accept my body as a good gift from God. In other words, we're back to the worldview issue. At the heart of the debate is the question, are we the products of blind, material, mindless forces, or are we the creation of a loving God who created this universe and it's therefore basically good? Even the fall doesn't negate that. I sometimes get students who say, yeah, okay, we're made in God's image, but the fall negated it all, right?
Yeah.
No. The fall is more like, if you want to think of an analogy, it's more like a beautiful masterpiece artistic masterpiece, and a child comes with a magic marker and scribbles on it. You can still see the Mona Lisa or whatever. You can still see the beauty shining through. And that's the message we have to have for our world today, is the beauty of who God created you is still shining through. And that's what we're embracing. So I would like to change the definition of the word affirm, because that is affirming.
Amen. And we have the ability to approach things with such a better, positive story of affirmation than what the world can give. To affirm, we're marred image bearers, but we're still image bearers. And we still, in our bodies, image the one who is so good. And that's the what we've been, for those that may have been listening to the series that we've been preaching so far, that's really the bedrock of where we're coming from is there a good God who can be trusted? And if the answer is yes, then it naturally plays to, therefore, the second part of that, which is, well, if he's the designer God, the creator God, and he can be trusted and he is good, then his design can be trusted and is good. And so what's actually best for me is to not act as Adam and Eve did. Of course, we have their sin nature, we have their residue in us, where we think that our design and what we want life to be and how we want to make our bodies and whatnot, that's what's best. No, but to actually align to the design of the good, trustworthy God and know that we are more loved and affirmed in him than we ever will be in anything this world can give us.
In my book, Love Thy Body, I have lots of anecdotes and a lot of pseudonyms. And they're pseudonyms because they're people I know,
right?
People in my family, people close to me who aren't necessarily ready to tell their story yet. But one of them I call Rebecca. And so she wrestled with same-sex attraction for many years, even after she was married.
Yeah. Sure.
It doesn't necessarily go away immediately.
Yep.
And so she eventually talked to her husband about it. And here's how he put it, because God made you female, you can be confident that no matter what your feelings are right now, you will be more fulfilled with a man. And of course, it goes both ways. He said, I'm a man, so whatever my feelings might be,
sure,
I can be confident that I will be more fulfilled with a woman. And that was a turning point for her. Now, it took another 4 years or so.
Yeah. It's not overnight. Sure.
It's not overnight. But that was, like that made sense. Like something just clicked in her brain. Like, of course, if God made you.
And he made us holistic beings, right? Yeah.
And made you female, biologically,
right,
your body. No, your feelings may be misleading right now. You can be confident that God will, that you will be more fulfilled. Or as one of my this is a student of mine who went off to college and she was from a small town. She never thought same-sex attraction would be a temptation for her. Just a very small conservative family in town and homeschooled. And then she went to college and she met women who were lesbians and she was completely drawn in. Sometimes, a concrete opportunity. It's like, this is what sin does to us, right?
Sure.
Sometimes we have no temptation unless there's a concrete opportunity. And suddenly we find it is a temptation. So she identified as lesbian for several years. And then by the time I met her, she became one of my students. She had gone back to a heterosexual identity, and she said the same word that you just used. She said, "I came to trust that God's design was better for me. That I should trust that if God had made me this way, this is how I would ultimately be happiest. It would ultimately be best for me." So she came to trust God's design. By the way, last time I met her, she was engaged. So
that's great.
To a guy.
Well,
by the way, you have to say that now.
To a guy. There you go. And, I'll just mention this. We're recording this before our sermon coming up, where we'll preach on singleness, and that there is a call to singleness for many people as well. That if we submit to God's design, well, it may not always mean that his design for you from a sexuality standpoint is going to always lead to marriage. It may very well be singleness. And I know there's many who are listening who are wrestling with that as well. So we'll save that for the next time.
Although I do deal with it in Love Thy Body. I'm just parenthetically, since you mentioned it, because in previous ages, there was not as much emphasis on people getting married. Look at the New Testament. Lazarus was not married, lived with his two sisters who were not married. And I mentioned that because I had an uncle. I think he was a great uncle. It's my grandfather's brother. Yeah, so great uncle. A great uncle who lived with his two sisters. he was unmarried, and he lived with his two unmarried sisters,
Same
just like
situation.
Lazarus.
Yeah.
And that was not considered a weird thing back then. It was more common. We don't realize, that cultural change, sometimes, we're in the middle of it, like the fish doesn't understand what water is. But in earlier ages, there was not as much emphasis on everyone having to be married.
Right.
And part of it was because you could be part of a household, even if you were not married. What happens is single people are lonely, right? So that makes sense. But in previous days, if you could be part of a household, we had some Egyptian neighbors. They moved in. They were very careful to say they were not refugees. They were asylees, which means they had religious asylum. They were Christians, and they moved in across the street from us. And they had a maiden aunt. That's kind of old-fashioned language, but an unmarried aunt was living with a family, and that was no big deal. That was common. So other cultures still have the notion that you can be single, and if you're part of a family, if you're part of a household, so that you're not alone.
Right.
It's much more common in those cultures for people to feel fine being single because, they have close-knit family relationships, even without being married.
Absolutely. Well, I would encourage you greatly that if you're listening or watching, that you would get a copy of Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey. And so much of what we've even discussed in this podcast today, she goes into great detail. And as she's mentioned, certainly there's a lot of data and moralistic argument in there that is so helpful, but a lot of stories, a lot of real life stories that help us kind of understand, hey, this isn't just something philosophical to talk about. This is real life. And God has a lot to say about it and how he has made us and designed us for his glory. So thank you for joining me again, Nancy. We are so grateful for you and for your insight and expertise in this area. And we'll look forward to just remaining in touch with you, hopefully, in the years to come. So join us next time. We'll continue this conversation on sexuality. We'll be joined by a friend of mine, Scott Sauls, who's also a pastor in Nashville. He'll have some great insight. You'll want to tune into that. Until then, check out some of our other resources, some of the other podcasts that we've done in the past with Digging Deeper, and we'll look forward to having you next time.